This is the story of how one little obscure African jungle plant rose to fame, helped to colonize the impenetrable interior of Africa, and became a celebrity. A part of the world which, for centuries, was known as white man's grave. Europeans shuddered at even the thought of it, and only the brave ever considered setting foot in white man's grave. If they dared, very few ever made it out alive. One little treasonous plant, selling out its own people, almost sailing across the oceans as a trading commodity, only to end up left in the African wilderness, forgotten by time and history, until now. It is a story full of irony. To understand this plant, our story starts here. It's 1703. There is this guy, Augustin Lippi. He is a well-renowned French-Italian physician and botanist who studies medicine at the University of Paris. He devotes a good deal of his short life to studying plants in Africa, and more so in Egypt. How wild plants may be used in medicine, and used in the well-being of human health in general. When we talk about the large quantities of modern medicines being extracted from wild plants, it all starts with guys like Lippi. They paved the way for scientists, who today devote their lives to the jungles of the world, discovering cures and prophylactics for many diseases, even cancer-fighting chemicals. Given that there are likely more than 100,000 still undiscovered jungle plants, it's very possible that cures for diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and many others aren't too far off on the horizon. Back to 1703, Paris, France. So this guy, King Louis XIV, commissions an expedition to establish trade relations and missionary activities with the nation of Ethiopia. Because of his knowledge and experience of the local cultures in northern Africa, Augustin Lippi is wrangled into becoming a part of King Louis's delegation. However, for state reasons, the delegation is intentionally not informed of the dangers they will most likely face on their trip. At the time, there are objections to the mission from several religious groups, including the Jesuits and Coptics. Despite many hindrances, which should have served as omens, the delegation eventually sets off, and not surprisingly, many things do go wrong. After several legs of the journey, they set up camp for several months in Sinnar, modern-day Sudan. And there, they encounter several delays, but they finally begin making their way to Cairo, Egypt. Unfortunately, it is on this part of the trip that they face several attacks, and, in November of 1705, Augustin Lippi is killed, along with 4 others in the delegation. The little treasonous plant at the center of our story would go on to be named after Augustin Lippi because of all the work he had done in his short, illustrious life in the field of botany and medicine. It is a jungle plant, native to the southern and central parts of Africa. It has a tropical flavor. Imagine vanilla meets lemon. Imagine they take a walk, they fall in love, and they have a weird little vanilla lemon baby. When classifying this plant, this vanilla lemon flavor led scientists to mistake it to be from the island of Java, which was known for its vibrant tropical flavors. We now know it to be incorrect, but the name Lippia javanica became established and stuck to this very day as the scientific classification. And then there's this guy, Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish physician and biologist who later studies the plant extensively and goes on to name it after himself using the L notation. But that's a story for another topic. Long after that, this plant, or lack thereof, Lippia javanica, could have single-handedly halted European settlements, or more realistically, significantly slowed down European immigration into some parts of white man's grave during the pre-colonial stage. Let me explain. So, it's circa early 1800s, southern Africa. Africa was rich. It was loaded, even still is today. The continent is laden with gold, diamonds, oil, minerals, unique plants and wildlife, and much more. I could go on for hours. Colonization is in the air. You can smell it from miles away. European explorers and missionaries are on the ground laying the foundation for a soon-to-come mass influx of European immigrants to the continent. With most colonization efforts in Africa, missionaries and explorers were first to set up camp, create settlements, and clear the way for the following masses of settlers. Decades later, more famous explorers and missionaries would set their gaze on the interior parts of southern Africa, like David Livingstone and his brother Charles, who later go on to explore the Zambezi mid-century. David Livingstone was one missionary who would cross paths with Lippia javanica and encourage explorers to carry it out to other Europeans along the African coast. So here we are, and the missionaries are going about their business. They are successfully beginning to settle among the African villages, and their settlements are beginning to grow as more Europeans arrive. But then suddenly, they are coming down with all sorts of illnesses: malaria, pneumonia, fevers, dysentery, cholera, sleeping sickness, and other unidentified ailments. Europeans possessed no immunity. They had almost no protection from these infections. And if you've ever heard of diseases like malaria or dengue fever, they are beasts of illnesses. So, disease is spreading through the encampments and the Europeans are dropping dead, even within days of contracting these illnesses. Their numbers are declining rapidly. At the time, this could very well have wiped out most, if not all, of the missions established in the African interior. It was a time of chaos and panic for the European settlers, where planning for a week, much less planning for years of colonization, became a fantasy. This continues for a significant period, up to the point that many explorers, including Audley, an explorer in Kazimbi, modern-day Zambia, consider returning to Britain, along with those remaining of their entire settlements. Audley writes, "There are riches to be exploited if a man should so possess the fortitude." However, the formidable opposition has presented itself in the cruelest of form. The African landscape, from its foreboding flora and fauna to its relentless reservoir of disease, is almost impenetrable. It has offered us time and again more final resting places than opportunity. The fevers are so voracious, such that, on any day, a man may rise in the most fervent of spirits, but behold that day's waning sunset as the last sight of his natural life. Audley contracts and dies of a fever 2 months later. This turn of events might have marked a stop, but more possibly, a significant slowdown in the migration of Europeans to the interior of southern Africa. There seemed to be no hope for escaping death for some of these missionaries and explorers. But as with many things in life, irony swoops in and saves the day. These Europeans actually find their savior in one particular plant of the African wilderness, a plant which had been used by the local people of the interior for thousands of years. It was used by African royalty for promoting longevity and by warriors after hard-fought battles to prevent infections and speed up the healing process. An example of how this plant comes into use takes place in what is now the country of Zambia. There is one interaction between an explorer settlement and the villagers of Silu, passed down in the local archives. As the missionaries are succumbing to these innumerable diseases and their numbers are dwindling, the local tribes begin to realize that they have a moral obligation to try and save the lives of the missionaries. Though suspicious of the settlers, at the time, they still considered Europeans to be friends with nothing but the best of intentions. However, one big obstacle stood in the way. Some Europeans considered local plant medicine to be inferior and sacrilegious. The locals had to find a way to administer their medicines without the missionaries knowing. As events unfolded, one of the village elders, a woman whose son had befriended one of the missionaries, approached the chief of the village and pleaded with him to approve a plan to deceive the sick missionaries into consuming the plant, Zumbani, without their knowledge. She proposed to devise a means by which to deliver this plant, Zumbani, into their food without them ever becoming aware of it. The Chief Karegu, was very hesitant at first, considering the missionaries' beliefs and the moral consequences of going against their faith should they end up dying anyway. As they watched more settlers continue to succumb to their fate, the chief's logic finally gave way to emotion and he approved the plan into action. As you've probably figured out already, Lippia javanica, our weird wild little vanilla lemon baby jungle plant, named for Augustine Lippi, is this plant Zumbani. So the villagers continue to gather Zumbani daily. They prepare a tea drink for the settlers and also mash it into their food. Very quickly, the missionaries begin to get their strength back and start returning to their daily assignments. As far as the missionaries are concerned, they have been healed miraculously and become even better physical versions of their former selves. They continue to thrive, but when they find out about the secret plan, they are enraged about the trickery. Some perpetrators are later imprisoned, others manage to flee, fearing harsher punishments. They are forced to repent for their deceit. Eventually, however, the missionaries begin to place very high value on this plant that allowed their mission to continue, Zumbani, Lippia javanica. They see the outcome as divine intervention to enable their work to carry on. Some even carry Zumbani out to coastal regions for other explorers and missionaries. They begin to call it fever tree and lemon bush. It becomes widely used by many new settlers to the region. Some Europeans even have plans to trade Zumbani and send it back to Europe as a medicinal commodity. Under its new aliases, lemon bush and fever tree, Zumbani becomes a celebrity. But as with all celebrity, when a shiny new thing appears, it's out with the old and in with the new. It was the discoveries of much more valuable resources which sidelined Zumbani. Imagine diamonds glistening on the ground or gold nuggets lying on the riverbed. That is how plentiful the African landscape was. Zumbani was almost on its way to sailing all around the world as a valuable medicinal commodity. But of course, the new discoveries meant the end to any plans to ship this old celebrity. Who would have wanted to fill their cargo space with plant leaves when they could stuff it with gold, silver, or diamonds? Zumbani would have to wait for another 200 years for its turn to sail across the oceans, giving us a chance to taste a part of history, the plant which made some early European life possible in white man's grave. And with that, the story of Lipia javanica was forgotten by time and history, lost to the African wilderness. We finally understand why Zumbani was so effective in helping early Europeans to survive the onslaught of disease from the African wilderness, and why future settlers would go on to use it as a prophylactic and avoid the illnesses suffered by their predecessors. This is why this forgotten plant resurfaced during the pandemic. It was a plant lost to the history of even some of the people whose ancestors used it for their survival. Lots of in vitro lab research has since been conducted over several decades for the effects of Lipia javanica on malaria, arthritis, pneumonia, respiratory illnesses, fevers, inflammation, and much more, both as a cure and a prophylactic. These are some of the numerous studies which are published in the United States National Library of Medicine. I'll include a link at the bottom of this video. Keep in mind that the website is property of the United States government, so be sure to check out the terms regarding the use of their information should you wish to copy or share anything from that website. And if you like to taste a bit of the history of white man's grave and try Zumbani for yourself, the weird little vanilla lemon baby, I'll also include a link at the bottom of the video. It's easy to imagine the villagers of Silu denying Zumbani to the dying missionaries and explorers based on their suspicions of their visitors' intentions, but then you would also have to imagine them denying life-saving aid and watching other human beings die in front of them. Did they have an obligation to save the lives of people who some suspected may be plotting them harm in the future? Put in the same situation, what would you have done? Would you have helped? Or would you have let nature decide? Tell us what you think in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to catch the next amazing story behind one of the little-known wild plants from around the world. I'll catch you on the next one.